Okay, I just want to talk about the fundamentals of dialectic. Well, not exactly dialectic as we know it. I have my own understanding of what dialectic really is, as opposed to the more positive sides of dialectic. So we know usually in Lacan, and I feel CSEC made this point kind of too, that usually the first stand, which honestly means knowledge, but I still want to use it as like the thing in origin. The thing, right? I feel like it's more of a negative concept at its start, right? It's not fully developed. So if we have that as a fundamental, that would kind of contradict what usually dialectic is seen as. Schelling's, Fichte, and Hegel had this understanding of the thing and its positive. Then there's the negative, and then there's some sort of solution. In Hegel, it's sublation, right? You take the concept, the core of it, and negate everything else that is not the concept or cores. You negate the excess while uplifting, surpassing the core of it. In Fichte, it's just the synthesis, which sucks. And in Schelling's, which is the one I use for my model for what culture really is, it's that the good, right? The good, because his dialectic is on morality basis or nature, the growth, the good, the growth, usually has a negation of the evil, the decay. And usually there's a new balance as a result where the good wins against the evil, the growth wins against the decay, and there's a new balance, a new growth. But if we actually look in a different fundamental, seeing the basis as negative at first, you can see, for example, Hegel's dialectic would be something that's fundamentally negative, and there's something put to it, right? A positive idea, but against that negative, and you kind of sublate the new balance, which would be, what do you get when you have negative and positive? You would have nothing, really. And when you sublate that nothingness, which would be a lack, you would create something. You would negate the lack while taking the core of what created it as a lack, and you get a evolved idea of it. I don't know if that fundamentally makes sense, but what made it nothing gets uplifted while the nothingness itself is negated and turned into less than nothing, which in Hegel would be a concept, and in Lacan would be, well, a dreadful thing. It would be like the real, which is why fundamentally I feel that Lacan's understanding of the self was dialectical at nature, even without my interpretation, the whole self-dialectic thing, because it was sort of based on that sort of idea, right? Negation, the positive, the sublation, the whole. I feel like fundamentally it was dialectical, even if it wasn't exactly using a dialectic up front, although I could see a dialectic forming in certain aspects. But regardless, so the whole dialectical solution that I created, okay, so this is going to be very post-Marxist, even, Marx, right? Marx had a dialectic in place and a solution for it. I know the dialectical materialism is a myth created by, well, Stalin and other people, but fundamentally, and I guess Engels also had a part in that, but fundamentally there was a dialectic form in his works, and that dialectic form does focus on the economy. You can see it in Das Kapital, but you can also see it in the foundation of the society and how it evolves in revolution. Usually people interpret that as the whole Stalin thing, the dialectical materialism. But I'd argue in Marx's work that it's not the dialectical materialism that Stalin puts out, but it's a similar concept on how societies evolve and such. It's not the way Stalin sees it, but it's a similar concept. I know a lot of left communists deny the idea of like the dialectic materialism, and I do disagree with Stalin's idea, but I do feel like there was something close to dialectic materialism in Marx's work. The solution of the economy being dialectic, right? As feudalism to capitalism, blah, 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 blah. And he also talks, well, Marx was very Eurocentric, but he did kind of was aware that it's not predetermined to happen. Capitalism could get stronger. Capitalism could turn into something else, like corporatism, or some petite bourgeois socialism. By the way, socialism is a petite bourgeois rule. That is what Marx said. Marx never referred to his version of communism as socialism at all. And, utopian socialism, which was what happened with Lenin, utopian socialism. On utopian socialism, I do believe Marx was a utopian socialist, much to his dismay, because he did outline a way for the transition into utopia to work, such that Lenin also did utopian socialism, except for Lenin was a very non-Marxist in that approach and was inspired by other utopian socialist works. But utopian socialism at itself is not bad. I feel like, while I did just call Marx a utopian socialist, I feel like he was more of a scientific utopian socialist. He planned how the process into utopia would work, not the utopia. Usually, utopian socialists plan the utopia and think that the utopia would just work if it was planned. But utopia only works as it comes out of a process that's planned, right? So North Korea, for example, considers itself a utopia because it's planned. That would be utopian socialism because they think that they're just perfect through their planning. USSR, I did call them utopian socialists before, but that would fall under a non-Marxist scientific utopian socialism. Because, until certain things happen where they just stop trying to transition. Because before, they were trying to transition into a new state, and the temporary state was planned. That's a sort of utopian socialism that Marx had, a scientific one that's about transition. And why did Lenin's idea and Stalin's idea of transition fail on a fundamental idea, other than the fact they gave up? It's because they didn't do it dialectically. They thought they could take something and have a gradual process instead of doing it dialectically. You see, dialectically, I feel like the solution to a dialectic, which I started with Hegel, right? Hegel has his the negation, which as we now know is the negation and the positive that is the negation to that negation, and you create the sublated idea out of the nothingness. The only way to counteract that is to have a negation that is instead a negation to itself, so it cannot sublate. So, okay. So here's where it differentiates between my understanding of dialectic and Marx's system. So Marx, right? Marx didn't really think about dialectic as this sort of self-negating idea. He didn't believe in the self-destructivity. He was more like a transition guy. He believed that there would be a transition, and he didn't really think about it dialectically. But his approach, in my idea of how it works, is dialectic. I would consider myself post-Marxist because of this. And honestly, despite the fact that his approach was dialectic, I do think he misunderstood how a dialectic solution would work. A dialectic solution is mostly about negating itself, so there's no need for another negation. So, this will have a split, but in the Hegelian dialectic, the one that Marx would usually use, right? I feel like that would be kind of different from the Schelling's approach, but in Hegel, for example, Hegel, the way to do that is there's a thing, right? And it's negation. Then there's a sublation process which creates a new thing, and you would have to keep getting better forms as such. Capitalism had its negation in itself, which feudalism had the negation in itself, and capitalism, blah, blah, blah. Capitalism negates itself with the worker bourgeois struggle, and therefore creates a sublated idea of communism. However, because the workers are self-negating, right? Communism, lower communism, self-negates itself into higher communism without the need of a new negation, which means that it negates itself and sublates itself at the same time. This is a self-negating position that solves the dialectic. There's no higher form because it's a form that just creates its higher form out of nothing. In Schelling's, the culture is all consuming, it would be really a different way to deal with it. So the culture consumes the counterculture usually, and that creates the new culture, but it's not a sublation process. Instead, it's just a failure of consuming it. So the culture absorbs the counterculture, and the counterculture gets part of the culture in it, as the culture gets part of the counterculture in it, while the counterculture is submerged, but not completely, in the culture. Like so you know those like chunks of chocolate that you find at the bottom of the chocolate milk after you stirred it and some didn't stir? That would be the counterculture. It has milk in it, and the powder of the counterculture mixed into the culture. I mean, the powder of the chocolate mixed into the chocolate milk, and the milk mixed into the chocolate powder. However, it didn't fully dissolve, so it's still there. The counterculture is de-revolutionized and if withheld inside of the culture, and the culture is slightly changed. Right? So the thing about progressivism, which is the form of counterculture we've had for all this time, is that it aims to solve one single issue, usually maybe some other issues at the same time, yet it aims to solve it in a way that doesn't fundamentally change all of society, just a small bit, right? It isn't a fully revolutionary part. Progressivism is the non-self-destructive counterculture. So ultra-progressivism is a more revolutionary, more focused on changing set. It is the counterculture that outweighs the culture. In Schelling's, good always defeats evil. Growth always defeats decay. Counterculture is decay. Growth is culture. Therefore, in this, it would be the subversion, putting Schelling's over his head, upside down. You would basically have the counterculture absorb the culture instead. And since the counterculture is something that breaks it down fully, being revolutionary, the counterculture and the culture would completely mix, because the counterculture would be the new culture. So it would be corrupted. However, if you understand that the counterculture in this is ultra-progressive, it is self-destructive. So it will tear itself away, and with that also tear the culture away. Therefore, the new culture, which is the ultra-progressive culture, destroys itself and destroys the old culture with it, leading to nihilism. Ultra-progressivism is a form of nihilism. However, nihilism would be like the upper form of it. Therefore, I know basically that sounds like the same thing, self-destructive. However, it's different. Instead, in the Schelling's dialectic, the counterculture completely absorbs and becomes the culture. There is no distinction. It becomes one. It becomes sublated. Or I guess if you want to use Fitch, it would just be a synthesis. But, I don't think it's a synthesis. It's personally sublated because it destroys itself. At first, it's a synthesis because it's a combination of culture and counterculture into one single being, but it sublates itself by negating itself while holding the core. The core is nihilism. The rest is culture. The core is uplifted into nihilism as the counterculture, the new counterculture-culture mix, which is ultra-progressivism, destroys itself. The core is nihilism, and it's sublated. Therefore, it's uplifted. Therefore, it is sublation. The solution to the Schelling's dialectic is to completely submerge counterculture in ultra-progressivism with culture in the traditional, and just destroy the traditional through the ultra-progressivism, and have the ultra-progressivism destroy itself, sublating itself into nihilism. So ultimately, what's the shared factor? Self-negation, self-sublation, self-destruction. That is the revolutionary potential. That is the dialectic. And while ultimately it's not really exactly what Hegel or Fichte or Schelling's or anyone who had dialectic had in mind with their dialectic, it is the main source that I believe dialectic works on. And I don't really know if I'm post-Marxist, because technically I accept Marx's idea of society at complete entirety, and I accept Das Kapital in its complete entirety, other than the whole infatuation and fetishization of value, because value ultimately does not exist, and it's just not real. However, I do think fundamentally that Marx's solution to society is self-negating and therefore acceptable for the dialectic, while Lenin's wasn't, because instead they tried to plan it in a way that was not Marxist. I don't know if that makes sense. But yeah. Now I think with the understanding of dialectic theory, I should talk about my Trinity idea. So, of course, we have three stages of society in my personal philosophy. You have God, the death of God, and the restoration of God. God had the complete unified self under one, which would be, the absolute self. Then you had nature, absolute nature, everything that exists. And then you would have absolute community. Well, yeah, absolute community, which would probably be the Hegelian absolute. Now, why these three? I mean, other than the fact, it's basically just three that was in Hegelian, like old German idealism. It's for other reasons too. Nature, right, is the material absolute. It is the absolute that we see all around us. It is everything. Therefore, it's a material absolutist. Self is the idealistic absolute. It is the idealism absolute. While I am materialistic, you could say, I do know that technically our society and the whole world and technically God itself is based in consciousness and mind. Just not in the way idealists believe so. So, the absolute of the self is the absolute as it is in the idealistic realm, which is technically just the same as the material realm, just it's really complicated to explain. So, the absolute of self would be the absolute consciousness altogether. All of our being, all of our minds, all of our consciousness altogether into one being that can create the world with its mind. That would be, God. If you see the Islamic understanding of what the world is, it's an idealistic form as God imagines the world in Islam. I believe that God, in this Trinity thing, both is the world through creating the world, nature, believes in the world and thinks of the world, therefore also creating the world in ideals, and in community, the Hegelian absolute, pretty much a Hegelian absolute, that is creating the world through complete collectionism. It's like the glue or the mix between materialism and idealism. Although Hegel called himself an absolute idealism, I believe the Hegelian absolute is more of a mix between the idealism and materialism. It is fundamentally the glue between the two. Complete collectionism, where the self is completely fulfilled and nature is uplifted through humanity. It is literally the mix of the two. Self is fulfilled through self-recognition as community is complete in a shared self, which technically you can find in the united self. However, the difference is that the community is more than just the united self. The community is also nature sublifted through itself. If you've seen Schelling's, you can see that man is the sublated version of nature itself, right? Schelling's had the idea that man was the best form of nature, the highest form of nature, and sublates nature into itself in the first place through the whole negation, whatever. And so that is what community is. Not man, but community. Community is ultimately the sublated nature and also the sublated self, the united self in complete entirety turned fulfilled. And so that's the importance of community in the first stage. Then eventually God died. Mainlander style. If you've seen my post-Mainlander essay, you'd know. The contradictions of self and all of this such, which is natural in the sort of material dualism thing. There's paradoxes, there's things that just simply cannot be united, I don't believe that there's material opposites. Opposites usually is a sign that a thing isn't even real in the first place. However, since the idealistic and the materialistic worlds were real at some point in combined eternity, that meant that ultimately, at that time, there were contradictions that couldn't be solved. Therefore, those contradictions, those things that couldn't be solved, the paradoxes, both in time and material, ultimately led to the death of God. And so we got a faulty version of it to fix it. Nature itself would turn into culture. Culture because culture is, a twisted version of... Okay, so not really culture actually, but yeah, culture. The nature we know right now is a form of culture, a culture of evolution, a culture of survival. So I would say it's a culture. When I say nature before, I meant like an absolute unity of all things. Nature is replaced with culture. The nature we have in the material world, I wouldn't really say a material world in complete entirety exists. I know that I'm a materialist, and fundamentally that, yeah, I believe in a material world over an idealistic world. However, the idea of material itself, and I know I'm going to get into semantics here, but, well, I'm probably not, but, like, I've had an argument on this in semantics before, and it was very annoying to deal with. I hate semantics, so I tried to avoid semantics, but the material world as it is a pure material realm does not exist. It exists in a dualistic form to the idealistic realm. And since we have neither of those right now, fundamentally I don't think we have a purely materialistic world or a purely idealistic world right now. What we have is a blank sheet that you can call a materialistic basis that we interpret through our idealistic mind, and we create our understanding of society in. However, you cannot change society with your mind, nor can you change society fundamentally with the material without your mind. So it's sort of a new realm. A new realm I'd call reality. Not in a Lacanian sense, although the Lacanian reality is a part of this reality. This reality would be a mix of broken material and broken ideal. And that would be the sort of new realm that we have now, which we can only affect with real things, instead of, the idealistic or material things. So, anyways, outside of all of that, now we have nature, which is replaced with culture. The culture of nature itself, culture of survival. The culture that comes after, tradition culture. And you could have, progressive culture, but that's just tradition culture that keeps trying to negate itself but fails because, the cultural dialectic we have right now. We live in a quote-unquote progressive culture, which is a culture that's traditional, that tries to negate itself with progressivism, but fails. That's why ultra-progressivism is necessary to solve the dialectic and completely negate itself, or sublate itself. But that wouldn't be complete negation, that would just be the natural process of self-complete negation. Then ultra-progressivism solves itself, but that's in the later side. I'll explain that later. So, we have culture as a replacement of nature. As a replacement of community, we have economy. You see this in Marx a lot. The economy is what replaces the original community that we have. We originally have community, and that's replaced with economy. The economy is a sort of strained, evolving form of community that tries to make it a society, quote unquote. You have a society based on a community, right? However, this form of community is broken and not the same as pure community that you see in a Hegelian understanding. This community is like capitalism, petite bourgeois socialism, utopian socialism, feudalism, tribalism, incomplete, issued forms of it that really doesn't have the same unity as community. That's funny. Look, I said community, whatever. And fundamentally, that's what makes returning to community so important in my interpretation of Marx. So important to Marx in my interpretation of Marx, and not Marx actually. Because it's a return to the Hegelian understanding of community as it is killed by economy. And so that's why you have communism, this whole self-negating, self-sublating into a new form that just is communism, and that's when you have utopia, a new fixed form of community. And that's ultimately my whole point of philosophy, is to recreate God. That's really the whole point of leftist politics and philosophy. It's to recreate God, which is ironic considering usually traditionalists are the Christians and religious ones, yet the left are the ones creating or recreating God. So there you have nature, community would turn into culture and economy. Now, what does the unity of self, the absolute self, turn into? Well, dialectical self. Self as we have now, the real, the lack, things that, honestly, I find gorgeous. The thing about the lack, honestly, is that I really like the lack. I like the idea of the lack. I like the concept of the lack. And if you've read any like Nick's Land works, especially the ones on transgender women and the sort of self negating lack and emptiness, cybernihilism is a very interesting concept for me. However, I don't really interpret it in a trans supremacist radical lesbian feminist way. I just think that all mankind kind of works like that. All mankind are fundamentally dysphoric, and the real creates lack in mankind. Mankind has lack, which is also desire, dysphoria, and euphoria. All emotion, all insecurity, all drive, and especially insecurity, because lack and insecurity are very, very, very much almost the same thing, but not. Insecurity is a result of lack and a mean symptom of lack. However, lack is something way beyond that. Lack is the closest thing we have to absolute negation, absolute nothingness. A negation that you can't even call sublated. And I know that Cizek tries to solve the lack with his whole transfer from lacan to Hegel to lacan to Hegel, but I don't see the point of that. The lack is the most beautiful things we have from the death of God. The lack, I would consider the death of God embodied into one lack of a thing, one less of anything. It is basically the lack of everything that remains after God's death. It is God's corpse. It is the lack of God's corpse. And that's what's beautiful about the lack. The lack really is basically just God. But whatever, we still have to solve the lack regardless. And what is the best way to solve the dialectical self that is created from the lack and its other components, which ultimately create all our desires in life and our will to live regardless, and any sort of persona that we embody to say that is ourselves, right? How do we solve the thing that makes us live? Well, bad news, you can't. However, I do think that a self-destructive value to being a person would probably be, I can't really tell people, I'm not going to tell people to do self-destruction. That's horrible. However, anti-natalism does reduce the amount of people until it eventually turns into nothing, causing there to be nothing to remain, right? It would be a self-destruction in a different form, because they can't just tell people to die. That'd be horrible. So instead, the next best thing would be to tell people to negate the population as a whole and the separate people, the separate selves, until it eventually remains into oneself in death, right? Not death, but like the lack of anyone to be there on the earth. So there's a bunch of people, right? I'm not gonna get into Stirner dialectics. Would I ever get into Stirner dialectics? I think I'd cry. Okay. So Stirner, right? I'm a post-Stirnerist, post-egoist, whatever you want to say. Fundamentally, my philosophy started at Stirner. However, now I have to realize that, well, since I realized that the ego, the self, does not exist by average, and is a dialectical thing with its processes, and that Stirner was more of a humanist than the humanists. Honestly, that remains one thing to really say about it. How do we solve the ego, the self? Stirner does lay out a dialectical self, even if he, didn't want dialectic. Stirner understood a reversal of dialectic. He saw one unity that separates into little bits, and that's the ultimate process of humanity. It should separate into bits, right? It should separate from one whole to a bunch of parts. And fundamentally, I disagree with that, honestly, because that's what happened in history, right? Things were sublated and separated and destroyed. The death of God happened. That is Stirnerite's dialectic, basically. Or, if you want to say anything, that could also just be Mainlander or Schopenhauer or any pessimistic thing, really. Stirner was kind of pessimistic, I guess. But one whole separating into parts. That is the enemy here. Stirner sees that as the best thing. I think we have to undo that. How do you undo one becoming into many? To cut off the resources from many to turn into even more many, you limit the amount of people that exist. Anti-natalism would do this the best way possible. You go from one to multiple to none. Because that multiple will not be able to reproduce or create more of them, it will ultimately have to unify in the extinction of the species, and that would be the best way to unify the self into one. We solve Stirner's whole dialectical nonsense with simple anti-natalism. You solve it by undoing it. And I know, like, oh, but isn't this like the result of like Fichte dialectic, right? I mean, culture, nature, that was Schelling's dialectic, and it was solved in a Schelling's dialectic form, right? And Hegel had his dialectic, and that was solved in a Hegelian dialectic form, The Fichte dialectic really isn't a dialectic at all, in full honesty. The thesis, antithesis, and synthesis really means nothing in whole entirety. It meant nothing for how he discovered the absolute. The way he discovered the absolute was not even close to his dialectic. It wasn't even... You don't need Fichte's dialectic to understand how he got to the absolute I, so his dialectic was pointless. However, as we've seen, Lacan's dialectic is not Fichtean at all, right? And Lacan's dialectic fits for the self and the dialectic of the self. So the self evolves in ways that are more obscured, right? More pessimistic. The self is more of a pessimistic dialectic than a singular Fichtean dialectic, such as, the whole Mainander thing. Because the thing about the self is that it's more important than any of the other ones. I mean, yeah, Hegel, super important, because it's the mix of the material and the ideal world and such, which I guess you could say is a forerunner for reality as we have now, but whatever. And the other ones were like community was Hegel, so it's nature and self, right? Nature is obviously important because it was the natural causes of things and also the fundamental thing that I'm focusing on, but whatever. It's also important because fundamentally nature is also the main form of God that we still see as if it was united today when it's not. It's the main delusion in our minds, the materialistic delusion of absolute unity that Spinoza fell for. I like Spinoza a lot. I'm a Spinozist, I'd say. But no, not really, not anymore, because fundamentally I've seen that there's more to it than just Spinoza's philosophy. But Spinoza, he understood a lot of things. And Spinoza's God, panentheism. Not pantheism, panentheism. Yeah, it's cool. But once again, fundamentally that's a delusion that is now accepted nowadays. That there's still an absolute material world, an absolute reality, an absolute... They conflate reality with material world for some reason. And that's the main delusion. That nature and culture actually push the most. Culture and nature are the ones that push this delusion of nature still existing and culture still existing the most out of everything else. So I'd say it's the most important in that category, such as Hegelian category. It's most important because it's a unity between the material and the ideal in that whole thing, and blah 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 whatever. And the self would be the most important in a different way, for it is literally embodying the death of God as a function for its dialectic. Like Mainander's dialectic. Well, Mainander didn't describe it as a dialectic, but I see his work through a dialectic standpoint. I really like Mainander. The death of God is embodied in the will of people, and the will of people ultimately leads to absolute death and disgrace, right? I mean, ultimately, that is what Mainander was saying. God dies, and we are his rotting corpse, and we slowly rot out of existence. We get from one big thing smaller and smaller until we're nothing. However, I see this in not as like Stirner's dialectic thing where it's like one big thing that separates into smaller and then separates into smaller until it's unified in each thing being its own one big thing, which would be Stirner's whole thing, One self turns into a bunch of selves, and then those a bunch of selves turn so small and so united in themselves that they are all one big selves. Except for they're not unified, they're just separate, and each one of them identify as their own one big self. I think that's kind of stupid. A Maynander pointed. Most people interpret Maynander as saying, that's sort of dialectic, the Stirnerite dialectic, the form of one big self turning into multiple selves, and, in this it would be will. One big will, God's will, turning into multiple wills, humanity, turning into so many wills that ultimately it fades out of existence. It dies, it rots. However, I interpret Maynander to be different. One big will, God itself, right? He dies, he separates into a bunch of different wills. That would be the thing, God himself, the ultimate perfection, which would also be a negation, destroys itself because it is solely negation. God was solely negation in Maynander's dialectic. My interpretation of Maynander, which is post-Maynander, in a dialectic, right? Post-Maynander dialectic, the God as we have, right? Perfect society, the utopia, was just a negation of any sort of negation. So it was complete unity, but it was only defined at the fact that it was not complete unity. So it stopped being complete unity and it self-destructed because it had contradictions inside, which was only realized when it realized it wasn't complete unity, but the lack of any sort of thing that stopped it from being complete unity. So its negation self separated into a bunch of different wills, a bunch of different gods. That would be humanity, the rotting corpse of God itself. Humanity, that's why the self is really important, because humanity is self, different selves. And all of those come from the will of God, which was God, will of God was God himself, remember? So the self is really the main successor of the dead God himself. And those selves, that would be the negation stage of all of this, right? The negated stage would be that God has turned into imperfection, a dead human earth thing. Kind of similar to how, God turned into Jesus and such. God turns into people. And then, as Jesus went and died and turned back into God, right? So, I'm sounding like a Christian atheist. I'm a Satanist, by the way. But fundamentally, I say that because I'm a negation to Christianity in this, because the Christian ideals are still kept. So you can see the Christian influence in my philosophy, however I subvert it. So that's why I call myself a nihilistic Satanist. But, so, just as Christ, died and became God again, spiritual again, so humanity will ultimately die out and become one single thing again. It will be one single spirit, one single soul, one single nothingness, one single lack. All the different lacks of the world, all the different spirits, souls, wills. I think the lack is the soul, the lack is the spirit, the lack is the will, the lack is everything. The lack, fundamentally, is almost everything that makes us people, and the lack is just beautiful for that. If you really want to talk to your spiritual thing, and you want to talk to your soul, and you want to talk to all of that, then just talk to the lack. Go take some psychedelic. I'm not going to say that. But anyways, the lack ultimately turns into one lack as everyone dies, because the lack of a lack is not no lack, it's a unity of lacks. After everyone dies through anti-natalism, which is not the same as any other method, after anti-natalism makes the whole species die out, extinction, all those lacks will be one lack, which I think Maynander didn't call for anti-natalism, but in my post-Maynander understanding, I believe that would be a dialectical solution, as Maynander believed that everyone would just wither away. Humanity would wither away as everyone rotted, as, God was rotting, everyone rotted, and everyone became nothing again. That is the recreation of God in Maynander's philosophy. Maynander's philosophy was a dialectic to create God, in my interpretation. His philosophy was from nothing, which was God, the negation, to a different negation of the negation, which was people, a broken society, humanity itself, and then you negate that back into a negation form. And that is nothingness, which is God again, since God was negation. Pure negation once again, God. Maynander was recreating God. That's what I believe. I believe his philosophy was a recreation of God itself. And so, that's why I believe that the solution to the self-dialectic is anti-natalism, because it will slowly, gradually fade humanity itself out of existence to an anti-natalist extinction, which would recreate God again. God would be successor to our lack. such as our lack was the successor to God and his death. Our lack will create God's rebirth. Such as Christ went to heaven, humanity have to die to recreate itself as God himself. And so, those are really the solutions. Now, to the recreation of God. I already explained it. Culture. Recreation would be ultra-progressivism. To create nihilism, the ultimate utopia. You have economy, right? The solution, lower stage communism. To ultimately create higher stage communism. Fine. Self. You start off with broken self. You use anti-natalism to ultimately create the new absolute self through no self at all, the lack of self. And there's your solution. That's all I really have to say about everything.